There's something about real historical combat archery which often gets massively overlooked, and it's a huge thing. Whether it's English longbowmen fighting at Agincourt, or whether it's Persians versus Greeks in the ancient world, or indeed even if it's Mongols on horseback, what often gets overlooked is that archers are very often shooting other archers. In other words, people who shoot back. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I've just got back from Fight Camp, my own event, which incidentally is the biggest UK HEMA event you can get to. It's over 300 people, 50 instructors. It was awesome, and one of the people there was Bloomin' X, someone you might know from YouTube and the internet in general. He is a pretty famous archer and very, very skilled, and he ran a wonderful session at Fight Camp, which essentially was looking at archery games where you can shoot at each other with kind of safe equipment, and it completely changes the nature of how you use the bows, how you move around, and every aspect of the equipment. And very often we're used to seeing archers shooting at static targets like this one here, or testing like arrows versus armor, where you have an armored opponent on foot and you are shooting arrows at them to see what the arrows do to the armor. But the reality is that in warfare throughout history, even into prehistory, very often archers were shooting at other archers. So here we're going to actually look at a couple of examples, one from history, the 14th century, and one from the modern day. Yes, bows are still used in the modern day, unfortunately, in violence, but we'll get to that in a second. So what does the fact that archers are often shooting at other archers, what does it change about our understanding of historical warfare? Well, first of all, it means that in some situations where no armour is involved, we're going to come back to armour in a second, or indeed where it's skirmishing, very often archers are going to be moving around. So you're not just standing there statically drawing and shooting, You're running around, you're hiding behind things, dodging behind things, dodging arrows. And it should be pointed out that you can absolutely dodge an arrow. They actually don't move that quickly, and usually in any sort of tests that we see where you use safe arrows to shoot at each other, if a person sees an arrow coming, very often they can dodge it. Or not just dodge it, in some cases they can knock it aside with whatever they're holding. And in fact, this was something that Bloomin' X covered in his awesome session there. So if you see something coming in, you can literally parry it with your bow. That's kind of mind-blowing, right? That's kind of like going, if you've seen the movie Equilibrium with Gun Fu, it's even got to the situation where you could literally knock an arrow aside, draw, and then shoot back. Or you could just dodge it and shoot. But these sorts of mobile use of archery equipment is something which we don't normally think about when we're shooting at static targets, or thinking about lines and ranks of archers shooting at cavalry coming at them, or French knights, or whatever it might be. So first of all is movement. Secondly is dodging. Thirdly is parrying. And when we're talking about ducking and weaving and dodging, not only is this something that happens in modern games like LARP or archery tag, which is huge fun to do, but it even still happens in tribal combat. The fact is, there are still civil wars, street violence, tribal violence, which are done with things like bows, slings, spears, and instead of just in this case, shooting at a target, a static target, they are shooting at each other while dodging and ducking and weaving. And this has been documented quite recently in street violence in Papua New Guinea. They've now replaced the bows pretty much with rifles, but which obviously increases the casualty rate. But you will see that when they're shooting arrows at each other, they are also dodging. In fact, they're spending more time dodging and ducking and weaving and hiding than actually shooting arrows. And remember, of course, that arrows run out. So if you're only carrying 6 or 10 or 12 arrows, well, you want to make them count, and also you want to get close to the opponent rather than shooting at 50 yards away. You're probably going to run at them, and we see this even in our games, but we see it also in street violence and civil wars now. You want to get close to them, because if you've only got a few arrows, some of these people have only got one arrow, you want to try and increase the chances of actually hitting an opponent. But equally, they're going to be dodging dodging. But in addition to that, I mentioned armour. Now, if we go to the European Middle Ages, it was normal, despite what you might see in some movies, it was actually normal for archers, when they could, to wear some level of armour. And in fact, if we look at the medieval manuscripts, we often see English, Burgundian, Italian crossbowmen and archers wearing levels of armour, sometimes a surprising level of armour. And obviously armour was expensive, but if you could afford, I'll just grab the nearest bit of armour to me, sabatons, if you could afford any bit of armour, particularly leg armour, helmets, obviously, anything at all for your torso, brigandines, mail shirts, you'd wear them. Not only because of hand-to-hand combat, and I think a lot of people just think, oh well, once the archer's sheaf of arrows is spent, then clearly they need to pull their sword out, or warhammer or whatever, or axe, and go into hand-to-hand combat. But in addition to that, if you're being shot at, and you have to stand in line and stand in ranks and groups, you can't dodge and move around very much. Armour becomes even more important. So just think about that for a second. If you are, for example, in the Wars of the Roses, and you have a group of Yorkist archers versus a group of Lancastrian archers, or indeed crossbowmen, if we go to Burgundians versus Swiss, same kind of period, and they're shooting at each other, then clearly if one side has armour which at least protects you against most of the missiles, and the other side, the other force of archers or crossbowmen, doesn't, then very clearly the side with the most armour is going to survive for longer and keep shooting for longer, and ultimately usually win. As we saw in Todd's arrows versus armour tests, armour usually protects against arrows. It doesn't matter how powerful the warbow is or the crossbow. If you have something like a brigandine, or you have any kind of plate armour at all, helmets, leg defences, usually arrows and crossbow bolts will glance off or fail to penetrate. Sometimes they will, but it's a massive changer of the odds. So wearing armour as well as being able to dodge, and the whole kind of dodging and using cover is something really for skirmishing. In battles, armour obviously becomes very much more important because you have to stand in formations and groups and you can't run around for the most part. Although it should be pointed out that in the Cressy campaign, the English do seem to have used the Wagenburg, or wagon fort, essentially, as a defensive, a mobile defensive formation. According to Michael Livingston, and I pretty much agree with his conclusions as far as I can see from the evidence. So absolutely using mobile fortifications, pavises famously used by crossbowmen, of course, to hide behind while they're reloading. The next thing is rate of fire. Now, I don't like to use that expression because obviously there's no this isn't a firearm, there is no fire, but it's a useful expression. Rate of shooting, if you like. Everybody knows the expression rate of fire. The number of missiles you can get off, yes. Generally speaking, a simple hand-drawn bow will have a far higher rate of fire, rate of shooting, than most crossbows. The one exception I can think of is the Chinese repeating crossbow, but they tend to be quite weak because of the necessity of being able to operate that mechanism. Maybe a weapon that we'll look at in the future. But generally speaking, hand-drawn bows are very much quicker, especially if you're Lars Anderson using light draw-weight bows. But even heavy war bows, you know, somebody like Joe Gibbs, for example, using a heavy war bow, can shoot quite a lot more arrows in a minute than a crossbow can. Now, if you've got 200 longbowmen versus 200 crossbowmen, arrow for arrow, shot for shot, generally speaking, the bowmen are going to win, and we're going to look at just such an engagement as that. So this is taken from the book The Road to Cressy. I highly recommend it. The English Invasion of France 1346 by Livingston and Witzel. Now, this is a great book because it doesn't necessarily focus that much on the battle. It's more the campaign that came before the battle. Very, very interesting book. I've actually cited it in previous videos I've done on here. Now, this one particular engagement, this is regarding a defense of a bridge, okay? And essentially the Earl of Warwick of the time, with a small party of men-at-arms, hurried forwards to take the bridge. But when he arrived at the bridge, Warwick found that his lightly armoured troops, fighting like tigers against the French men-at-arms, were not only holding their own, but gaining the upper hand. Quickly appreciating the situation, Warwick disregarded his orders and led his little force straight into the attack. The fighting that raged around the bridge was confused and bloody and lasted for several hours. Long time in medieval conflict terms. Initially, Warwick could make little headway along the bridge itself. Bridges were famously used as choke points. Okay, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, so terribly represented in the movie Braveheart, was a battle over a bridge. The Battle of Stamford Bridge. Bridges are very, very important choke points in terms of battles, and throughout history have been. The houses on the bridge, because this was a large bridge with buildings on it, were set on fire, probably by the English seeking to use the smoke as cover, but the barricade and towers at the south end were resolutely defended by Eu and Tankerville, and despite fierce fighting at close quarters, Warwick couldn't dislodge the defenders. Further east, English and Welsh archers dodged around the buttresses of Saint-Pierre and shot into the Genoese in their boats at close range. Now, let's just put the book down for a second. The important part to note here is the English, obviously, on the Crécy campaign, most of their soldiers, at least a good half, probably more, were longbowmen. Okay, so you've got the English with longbows, and the French are using a mixture of militia forces raised with hand weapons, whatever they could get, and armoured to some extent, probably in some cases, their own local crossbowmen, but importantly, hired Genoese, that is from Genova or Genoa in northwest Italy, mercenaries essentially. So they were professional crossbowmen. It has to be said, although they were famous crossbowmen, they didn't perform very well against English longbows. And the main reason was rate of fire, rate of shooting. Okay, right, so let's come back to the thing. And now these Genoese crossbowmen had been placed cleverly on a barge in the water, okay, which meant that they couldn't be taken out, very easily anyway, in hand-to-hand combat because they were floating on a barge. What a brilliant idea. Seems like tactical genius. Except, usually water's lower than the banks either side of it. So it does mean that they are lower, which probably didn't give them a very good field of fire and vision, and the fact that they might be they're shooting upwards and other people are shooting down at them. And they're on a barge and they're armed with crossbows, obviously, because they're Genoese crossbowmen. Anyway, so the English archers came up and shot into the Genoese in their boats at close range. The latter replied with volleys of crossbow bolts. But the high rate of fire of the longbow quickly made itself felt, and though the archers were few in numbers, their arrows, as the Grande Chronique describes it, fell thick as hail. Someone seems to have had the bright idea of using fire arrows. This is supposition, incidentally, for at least two of the boats were set on fire. They could have been set on fire in other ways. As the numbers of the crossbowmen diminished, because the rate of fire of the longbows is higher than the rate of fire of the crossbowmen, Welsh foot soldiers began wading into the river. This showed almost suicidal courage, for as they approached the boats, the crossbowmen could scarcely miss, but the Welsh came on, covered by their own archers. Traditionally, in case you didn't know, the northern Welsh were famous as being spearmen and using the schiltron like the Scots did, whereas the southern Welsh were famous as archers. So they recruited different soldiers from different parts of Wales for different purposes. The crews of several boats were slaughtered and the boats themselves captured, and the victorious Welsh began landing on the south bank of the Odon. The remaining Genoese either abandoned their boats or rowed them down the river and fled. So we've got a very simple equation there, where the Genoese crossbowmen, who in any normal terms and against lots of other opponents would have been highly effective, and they were in a very defensible position floating on boats in the river, were no good against longbows. And there is some implication that there weren't even many longbowmen there, but because of the rate of fire, rate of shooting, the speed of shooting of the longbows, just could outmatch the crossbows. However, that's not to say that longbows would always dominate over crossbows. And one situation, and the other one I want to come to in this video, is range. So here we're specifically talking about missile troops versus missile troops. Now, if you have a force of javelin throwers, clearly you can't throw a javelin as far as you can shoot any kind of arrow or crossbow bolt. So javelins are generally going to be dominated by bows. Javelins are very powerful at close range, but they obviously can't match the range of bows. Crossbows versus longbows is an interesting matter because it depends very much on the nature of the crossbow as to what its maximum effective range is. Now, a typical longbow or warbow, let's say between 100 and 180 pounds draw weight, pretty high. They tend to shoot in war, in the 100 Years' War and Wars of the Roses period, 14th, 15th centuries, tend to shoot pretty heavy arrows, and they tend to have a range of between 200 and 300 meters. Now, indeed, there are other bows out there. There are types of Asiatic bows, for example, which are shooting lighter arrows. Turkish recurves, for example, Persian bows, some Indian bows, Tatar Mongol bows that can shoot further. Okay, they can shoot up to 300-400 meters, even 500 meters and beyond with specific flight arrows and specific bows. These arrows are of limited use in warfare, certainly where armor is involved, because they're quite fragile and light, so they're designed for very long range. You could harry cavalry, you could annoy people, but fundamentally they're not going to penetrate any armor. So generally speaking, in the Anglo-French wars, the longbows had a range of up to about 300 meters max. Okay, crossbows can exceed that. Crossbows can, specific types of crossbows can exceed that by quite a way, but the more powerful the crossbow is, the slower it is to load as a general rule. So a hand-cocked crossbow will have a much shorter range than a longbow. So although you can increase the rate of fire, speed of shooting with a crossbow by lowering the draw weight, like the Chinese repeating crossbows, which work on a kind of crank, a lever, you have to put the draw weight way down. So as the draw weight goes up to match the equivalent of the longbow or warbow, the range of those bolts increases, but the rate of shooting massively decreases. And when we go up to the really heavy so-called siege crossbows, as video games would call them, where you can massively exceed the range of a longbow, the rate of shooting is incredibly slow because you're having to use a windlass. Right, so we've got many things at play here. We've got dodging and weaving and hiding behind things. We have got the use of mobile fortifications and shields to protect yourself while you're reloading your bow or crossbow, whatever you're using. We've got the issue of armor penetration. You need to have a bow which is effective against armor, and therefore that reduces, generally speaking, reduces the rate of shooting, because lighter bows, yes, they're quick to draw, but they're useless against armor and don't have so much range in general. But the fact that archers and crossbowmen would actually wear lots of armor, because this would protect them while they were shooting, not just in hand-to-hand combat. And finally, we've got the issues of the fact that archers versus archers, hand-drawn bows, much faster than crossbows, even if crossbows are generally speaking more accurate. And finally, the fact that the crossbow's effectiveness is also related to its weight. So all of these things in a package, and there are other issues you could bring in. Let me know down below in the comments if you can think of other things as well. But the point to make here is that whether it's in Hollywood movies, video games, general, books and general, even history books in some cases, unfortunately, often talk about the bow, and I think here on YouTube often we talk about the bow versus an asymmetrical opponent. French knights on horseback, or advancing Vikings, or the Mongols being horse archers shooting people on foot. Whereas the reality is that a huge amount of history, and unfortunately even sometimes modern violence, involves one side shooting missiles and the other side shooting missiles back. And this hugely changes, I think, how we should look at the bow when actually deployed in combat, because it's really quite different than just standing there doing archery at a target which isn't shooting back. Imagine shooting arrows at another archer who is also shooting arrows at you. It changes all sorts of things. Right, okay, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.